Hi, so I'm just gonna take a moment to talk about this question here, question 6. We're looking for the main point. So we're identifying the conclusion for this one. All right, so they say some judges complain about statutes that specify mandatory minimum sentences for criminal offenses. So that first sentence is just describing a complaint that judges have. Very unlikely that this is going to be the conclusion. We're looking for relationships of support, though, and for language that indicates like what's the thing that they're trying to persuade us of. So we want the end point of their persuasion as opposed to like the reasoning that they use along the way or the evidence they use along the way. Okay, so some judges complain about statutes that specify mandatory minimum sentences for criminal offenses. These legal restrictions, they complain, are too mechanical and prevent judges from deciding when a given individual can or cannot be rehabilitated. Okay, so the first two sentences are like describing the reasoning of these judges and their complaint. And then we get this like contrast word, right? This change. So we have but now, but that is precisely why mandatory minimum sentences are necessary. So this seems like it could very likely be the conclusion. And that the rest of the paragraph, if it's explaining why mandatory minimum sentences are necessary, um, uh, or explaining how the thing that judges complain about is the reason we need mandatory minimums, then yeah, like that would be the conclusion sentence. So the sentence that is like the most supported by the information and is like the opinion of the author that they want to persuade us of, that would be the conclusion. So what do they say? They say history amply demonstrates. So demonstrates is an indication that they're using this as evidence, like they're using it to show us their point. So history amply demonstrates that when people are free to use their own judgment, they invariably believe themselves to act wisely when in fact they're often arbitrary and irrational. There's no reason to think judges are an exception to this rule. So all of this is saying judges, when they're free to use their own judgment, believe themselves to act wisely, but they're actually often arbitrary and irrational. And so these legal restrictions of mandatory minimums that prevent judges from deciding when a given individual can or cannot be rehabilitated is a good thing. It's necessary to prevent their often arbitrary and irrational decisions. And so limiting their freedom to use their own judgment is a good reason for mandatory minimums. So I would definitely conclude that this sentence here in the middle is the conclusion. It does use a reference word, the word that. Like that is precisely why mandatory minimum sentences are necessary. So what is it that is the reason we need mandatory minimums? Because it's going to prevent judges from making decisions, basically, from like making individual or case by case decisions. It's going to limit their discretion. Yeah, so, okay, so A, people believe they have good judgment but never do. I don't think that that's even like expressed. It's just that they often don't have good judgment rather than never. So A doesn't accurately express anything in the argument. B, mandatory minimum sentences are too mechanical and reduce judicial discretion. That's what the judges think, right? Like that's their complaint, not the author's conclusion. C, judges should be free to exercise their own judgment. Again, this is what judges think rather than what the author of the passage thinks. Judges are often arbitrary and irrational. The author does think that, but that's something that's used as support. So because judges are often arbitrary and irrational, that's why mandatory minimum sentences are necessary. So E is the correct answer. Okay. So that best expresses that middle sentence. Mandatory minimum sentences are needed to help prevent judicial arbitrariness. So why is it necessary? Because it prevents judges from deciding on a case-by-case basis. And they're often, their decisions, just like anybody's, are often going to be arbitrary. So yeah, I would go with E here. Okay. Right. Yeah, and just to comment on A again, never is too strong. It doesn't actually, that's not actually stated in the passage. The passage just says often. So we know that A is incorrect for that reason. If it said people believe they have good judgment but often don't, that would still be wrong because it would be the support that's offered rather than the conclusion itself. All right. I'm going to find the next question up. Section 3. So I'm looking up test 31, section 3, question 14. It's another conclusion question. All right. Great. So conclusion question. What expresses the conclusion of the ethicist argument? Meant to highlight that. Okay, so both ASA and TPA are clot dissolving agents. Recent studies show, what do they show? They show that the more expensive agent, TPA, would save at most 2 more lives than would ASA out of every 50 cardiac patients to whom they are post-operatively administered. However, since introduces support. Okay, so we've got support here. Since the relatives of the patients who die simply because they were given the less expensive medicine would be particularly grieved, the financial savings involved in using ASA over TPA must also be weighed against such considerations. Okay, so we've got the study, but then we have contrast word, however, we have this phrase between these commas that begins with since. So that's support. What is it supporting? It's supporting the idea that we need to weigh in the like the grief of relatives of patients who would die because they were given ASA, the less expensive medicine, rather than TPA. Um, so yeah, sorry, the financial saving needs to be weighed against. So they're just saying it needs to be weighed against it. Um, not that it like automatically overrides uh the the financial saving. All right. What's the conclusion? ASA should never be given to postoperative cardiac patients in pace. Uh, that's too strong, that language. Never. We don't like that. TPA is slightly more effective. That's true according to the passage, but it's not what they're trying to convince us of, ultimately. The extra expense of TPA cannot be weighed simply against the few additional lives saved. Cannot be weighed simply. That's interesting. Um, that one at least is talking about the weighing of the expense. Financial saving involved in using ASA over TPA must also be weighed against such considerations. I think there's something here to be said, like for the word simply, like it can't be weighed simply against the few additional lives saved. Like it would be complex because of their particular like grief, and that like, my relative would still be alive if they'd just use the more expensive medication. So I would flag C as having potential and then move on. D, ASA is a less expensive clot dissolving agent than TPA. That's just like factual information. It's not what they're trying to persuade us of ultimately. They just like offer that as kind of background to the issue. E, relatives of a patient who has died grieve more if the patient received ASA rather than TPA. Possibly, it's not quite what they're saying, and it does most resemble the part that follows the word since. So it more resembles support than the conclusion. So I would have to eliminate it. Um, and I'm not sure that it's technically correct because it's more that it's the ones who are grieving, and those patients could have or would have survived if they'd been given TPA. So it's not necessarily all of the ones who were given ASA, but just the ones where the difference between ASA and TPA would have made it all the difference in their case and would have ultimately like saved their life. So it's a little bit more complex than that. But I think C is the only one that really deals with this idea of weighing the considerations. Even though it's kind of oddly worded, I can confidently eliminate everything else. So I would have to go with C. All right. Tough question. Usually, conclusion questions are not going to be quite that challenging, but yeah, that one's quite tough. All right. Moving on, I'm now going to go to prep test 34 and look at section 2, question 15. So I'll pull that up when I find it. Okay. Sharing. Right. So we have camera manufacturers typically advertise their products by citing the resolution of their camera's lenses. The resolution of a lens being the degree of detail the lens is capable of reproducing in the image it projects onto the film. So, okay, they just define resolution there, but for that sentence, it's really just about the camera manufacturers are advertising their products by talking about resolution. Differences between cameras in this respect are irrelevant for practical photography, however. So these differences, so this is like a comment that they're making in contrast to like what these manufacturers are advertising. So they're saying that, yeah, these differences aren't actually relevant. And then they give a reason why. So we see the word since, which indicates support. So all of this would be support, and it supports what I have in yellow there. It supports that the differences in resolution, right? So that's what they're referring to when they say in this respect, right? So in what respect? In respect of resolution that's being cited, right? The resolution of the lenses. So that's irrelevant. So that's really what I would want to focus on. I want to ignore, for the purposes of answering this question, I want to avoid anything that follows the word since, because that's support, it's not the conclusion. Okay, so yeah, looking at my answer choices, camera manufacturers ought to concentrate on building other desirable qualities into their camera lenses rather than concentrating only on lens resolution. Um, they don't really go so far as to say what the camera manufacturers should do in terms of like building. I think it's more that point of like this particular thing is irrelevant. B, apart from differences in resolution, there's no practical difference in quality of images. No, actually, it's kind of saying the opposite of that, right? That differences in resolution that's the part where there's no practical differences among modern cameras. So it's not B either. C, advertised differences among cameras in the resolution of their lenses have no practical bearing on the camera's relative quality as photographic tools. I really like C. C is looking like the correct answer to me. I think that definitely covers what we see in that middle sentence that is the conclusion, or that part of that last sentence, right? In the middle, that is the conclusion. So differences between cameras in terms of resolution of their lenses are irrelevant for practical photography. Yeah, no practical bearing on relative quality. Yeah, really like C. D, in concentrating their advertising on the issue of image quality. Are they concentrating on image quality? I'm not sure that they actually are. I'm not sure that that's accurate, and that manufacturers are making a mistake about the interests of potential purchasers of cameras. Yeah, this is not discussed. That's D is incorrect. It doesn't represent anything in the argument. E, differences among photographic films in the amount of detail they produce have a more significant effect on the quality of the developed image than do differences in the resolution of camera lenses. So this would be like an inference that I could come to based on what I'm given in the support, but it's not the conclusion of the argument. It's not actually discussed in the argument that the films are going to have a more significant effect than the resolution. I think that's fair to conclude that based on the support that we're given, but it's not the conclusion that the argument is actually driving at. It's not what they are trying to convince us of. They're more concerned with saying that the differences that are cited by camera manufacturers in advertising, that those differences aren't actually relevant for practical photography. So E would also be incorrect, and C is the correct answer there. Right. Got one more question to go over. So it's from prep test 35. And it's in section 1. Now this is if you, all of these section numbers here are if you're looking at like PDFs or original prep tests. If you're on Law Hub, then you're going to be looking at section 2 for this one rather than section 1. So on Law Hub, they moved everything around so that for the vast majority of the tests, section 1 is games, 2 and 3 are logical reasoning, and 4 is reading comprehension. So just, yeah, keep that in mind that the sections aren't going to match up from these PDFs to Law Hub. All right, sorry, new share. So, question 16 for this one. Okay, another main conclusion question, likely another difficult one. Great. So, on the basis of the available evidence, Antarctica has generally been thought. So you start to see these patterns a lot, right? So the fact that like that was like a general conclusion that people had come to in the past is already cueing me to think that the conclusion is going to be a contrast and talk about what's thought now in contrast to what was generally thought in the past, or like a new idea by like a smaller group of people as opposed to what's generally the case, like generally thought by a larger group of people, or the sort of traditional view. So it's quite common that the LSAT is going to like play on that relationship between a traditional perspective and like a modern or new perspective. Okay, so I'll get back to the point. All right. On the basis of the available evidence, Antarctica has generally been thought to have been covered by ice for at least the past 14 million years. Recently, however, so this is getting to what is the author's opinion now. 3 million-year-old fossils of a kind previously found only in ocean floor sediments were discovered under the ice sheet covering central Antarctica. About 3 million years ago, therefore, so it's definitely one conclusion, right? So based on this new discovery, they're saying that the Antarctic ice sheet must temporarily have melted about 3 million years ago. After all, okay, so that typically is going to indicate support. After all, either severe climatic warming or volcanic activity in Antarctica's mountains could have melted the ice sheet, thus raising sea levels and submerging the continent. So this strikes me as a subsidiary or intermediate conclusion, as opposed to the final conclusion. Yeah, so traditionally thought being covered by ice all this time, but they found some stuff that was only found on the ocean floor, and it was discovered under the ice sheet covering central Antarctica, and so they're saying it must have temporarily melted. After all, one of these two things could have melted the ice sheet and thus raised sea levels and submerged the continent. And that would provide like an explanation as to why we found these fossils that usually we would just find like on the ocean floor, but we actually found them in Antarctica. So the Antarctica must have been submerged. Yeah. So that means that there must have been melting. Yeah, so this one I'm going really based off of structure and pattern, to like feel really confident that that's the conclusion. But you can also see from the relationship between the ideas that it's all pointing towards the ice sheet must have temporarily melted, based on like all of this evidence as well as this. So yeah, it's kind of pulling all of that together to get us to the conclusion that the ice sheet must have temporarily melted at that time. So A, it's no longer generally thought to have been covered by ice for the past 14 million years. I think the conclusion's a bit more specific than that, but um, yeah, and I actually don't know whether um, that's even accurate because we know that it had generally been thought that it was covered by ice for the past 14 million years. We don't know that this new discovery has changed the general thinking yet, right? It might take time for consensus to build, and for other scientists like be convinced. B, it is not the case that ancient fossils of the kind recently found in Antarctica are found only in ocean floor sediments. Okay, so that is an accurate statement. I do not believe it's the main conclusion. I don't think it expresses the main conclusion because it doesn't express that like middle green bit. It kind of matches what we see above that in the orange, like in support. Um, so yeah, I would eliminate B. C, the ice sheet covering Antarctica has not been continuously present throughout the past 14 million years. I prefer C to A, so I'm going to eliminate A. Um, the conclusion is more specific in saying about 3 million years ago, it must have temporarily melted, but C is close. D, what caused Antarctica to be submerged under the ice was the melting of the ice sheet that had previously, what caused Antarctica to be submerged under the sea was the melting of the ice sheet that had previously covered the continent. So the cause. Um, I don't like D better than C. Um, how do I articulate why? What caused Antarctica to be submerged under the sea was the melting of the ice sheet that had previously covered the continent. I think that like causal piece more matches what we have in the support. Like the conclusion is really just that the ice sheet must have temporarily melted. The conclusion isn't concerned with the cause. It's the reasoning that gets you that talks about the cause to convince you that it must have temporarily melted. And they're concerned with convincing you that it must have temporarily melted because they are pushing, like their agenda is to go against what has generally been thought in the past, right? They start out with that, what the general thinking was, and now they're talking about, yeah, but now we have this new discovery, and here's how this new discovery shows that past thinking is actually incorrect. And in fact, about 3 million years ago, there must have been a temporary melting, and so it wasn't completely covered in ice for the past 14 million years. That's more like the thrust of the argument is pushing toward that point, as opposed to pushing toward what is the cause of it being submerged. So D seems like a trap, although quite a nuanced trap. I could definitely understand being tempted by D. Okay, E. The ice sheet covering Antarctica was melted either as a result of volcanic activity in Antarctica's mountains or as a result of severe climatic warming. Sorry, that is part of the support for the conclusion. It is not expressing the conclusion itself. So C would be the correct answer for this question. Okay. I hope that helps with those ones. If you have follow-up questions, just let me know. Yeah, all right. Have a good one, and yeah, get in touch if you have any other questions. Thanks. Bye.